Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the darkness beneath the Fang, where the mountain's ancient heart beats with forgotten power, there stands a warrior who has seen the birth and death of empires. His sarcophagus, adorned with wolf skulls and runes of warding, sits in reverent silence among the tombs of heroes. Ice crystals form upon adamantium plates that have witnessed 10,000 years of war. Within this shell of blessed metal and ceramite rests a consciousness that remembers when the galaxy was young, when the Emperor walked among mortals, and when Primarchs still led their legions into the void. His name is Bjorn, though he bears many titles: the eldest, Trueclaw, the revered one. But perhaps most significant of all, he is known as the last from the company of Russ. To understand what this means, you must first grasp the weight of 10 millennia. Imagine standing at the edge of human history and looking back through the ages. Every empire that has risen and fallen, every civilization that has turned to dust, every generation of warriors who have lived and died in the Emperor's name, all of this has occurred during Bjorn's existence. He is not merely old. He is ancient beyond the comprehension of those who wake him from his slumber. He is a living bridge between the age of legend and the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. When he speaks, it is not with the voice of a warrior recounting tales heard secondhand, but with the authority of one who was there, who fought beside the Wolf King himself, who saw the Emperor's face and lived to remember it. The Space Wolves revere him as they revere few others. Even Logan Grimner, Logan, the great wolf who has led the chapter for more than 700 years, defers to Bjorn's wisdom when the ancient warrior awakens. To the youngest Bloodclaws, those fierce aspirants who have only just earned their place among the chapter, Bjorn is a figure from myth made manifest. To the Grey Hunters, those seasoned warriors who form the backbone of the Space Wolves, he represents the pinnacle of what a son of Fenris can become. And to the Long Fangs, those grizzled veterans who have seen centuries of war, Bjorn stands as a reminder that even their considerable experience is but a moment in the span of the chapter's history. But Bjorn is more than just the oldest living space marine in the Imperium. He is a paradox, a tragedy, and a testament to the cruel necessities of eternal war. He is a consciousness trapped within a walking tomb, was a warrior whose body was too broken to heal, but whose spirit burned too bright to let die. For more than 9,000 years, he has endured an existence that few could bear, waking only to fight or to share his memories, then returning to the darkness of stasis sleep, where time becomes meaningless and the centuries pass like dreams half remembered. The wolf, before the tomb, before he was the eldest, before he became entombed in a shell of adamantium and blessed steel, Bjorn was simply a warrior of the third great company of the Space Wolves Legion, the Vlaika Fenrika, as they called themselves in the old tongue, the Wolves of Fenris. He served under Jarl Ogvai Helmshrot, a commander known for his tactical acumen and fierce loyalty to the Wolf King. In those days, during the closing years of the Great Crusade, Bjorn was unremarkable among his brothers, not in terms of skill, for he was a capable warrior even then, but in temperament and bearing. Where other Space Wolves embraced the boisterous camaraderie and ritualized ferocity that defined their legion, Bjorn stood somewhat apart. He was quieter than his brothers, more taciturn, quicker to irritation than to laughter. The conservator Caspar Horsa, who would later serve as Skjald to Bjorn's company, theorized that this naturally negative attitude was simply part of who Bjorn was. A man of few words and little patience for foolishness, even before the tragedies that would shape his destiny began to unfold. But this dour nature did not make him any less effective as a warrior. If anything, it sharpened him. While others might lose themselves in the fury of battle, Bjorn maintained a cold focus and a calculating precision that made him deadly in ways that raw aggression alone could never achieve. His first truly notable action in the Imperial records was, ironically, a mistake. During the approach to Fenris, As the conservator Caspar Horsa's shuttle descended toward the frozen world, Bjorn's overzealous defense of his homeworld led him to shoot down what he perceived as a potential threat. The shuttle crashed among the Askamani tribe, and only Bjorn's subsequent intervention prevented Horsa from being killed in the tribal disputes that followed. As penance for this error, Bjorn was assigned to serve as Horsa's guardian, a duty he accepted with characteristic reluctance and ill grace. This seemingly minor incident would have consequences that rippled across the decades to come. Through his time guarding Horsa, Bjorn found himself drawn deeper into events that would ultimately shape the fate of the galaxy. The conservator was no mere observer. Unknown even to himself, Horsa had become a vessel for dark powers, a pawn in schemes that reached far beyond mortal comprehension. Through him, the forces of chaos sought to manipulate the Space Wolves, to turn them against their brothers in the Thousand Suns Legion, to light the fuse that would explode into the catastrophic war known as the Burning of Prospero. But before that conflagration, there were other campaigns, other battles. Bjorn fought in the assault against the Olamic Quietude, a technologically advanced Xenos civilization that threatened imperial expansion in their sector. He stood among the honor guard when the Space Wolves traveled to the world of Nicaea, yet where the Council of Nicaea would determine the fate of psychers throughout the Imperium. He witnessed the judgment that would condemn Magnus the Red and the Thousand Suns, though he could not have known then how this decision would lead to tragedy beyond imagining. During these campaigns, Bjorn carried himself as a professional warrior, efficient and deadly, but not yet marked by the darkness that would soon descend upon him. He bore a bolter modified with a pistol grip, allowing him to fire one-handed, and he wielded a wolf claw on his left hand, not as a weapon primarily, but as a replacement for the hand he would lose, for the Iron Priests had refused his request for an augmetic replacement after an earlier injury. In typical Bjorn fashion, he had simply stolen a wolf claw and adapted it as both appendage and weapon. But this unconventional approach spoke to his practical nature, his willingness to improvise and adapt rather than accept limitations. His hair was black and braided in the fashion of Fenris, and his face bore the tattoos and ritual scarring common among the Space Wolves. Those who knew him in those days remember him as sullen, quick to anger over small things, but fiercely loyal once that loyalty was earned. He drank with his brothers when custom demanded it, fought alongside them with unwavering courage, and maintained the bonds of pack and kinship that defined the Vlaika Fenrika. Yet there was always something held in reserve, some part of Bjorn that remained isolated even in the midst of his brothers' camaraderie. Perhaps this was why, when the darkness came to Prospero, Bjorn would be one of the few who could face it and survive with his sanity intact. The Burning of Prospero. When the Emperor's command came down to sanction Magnus the Red and his Thousand Suns Legion, the Space Wolves answered with grim determination. The Council of Nicaea had declared the use of sorcerous powers forbidden, and Magnus had violated this edict in spectacular fashion, using his powers to breach the Imperial Palace's psychic defenses and warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery. The method of this warning, shattering wards that had taken the Emperor himself years to construct, could not be overlooked. The sentence was passed. The Thousand Suns would be brought to compliance by force if necessary, but what began as a mission to apprehend a wayward Primarch became something far darker. The whispers of chaos, us working through compromised intermediaries and corrupted astropaths, twisted the orders. What should have been an arrest became an execution. What should have been judgment became annihilation. The Space Wolves, believing they carried the Emperor's true will, descended upon Prospero with the Custodian Guard and the Silent Sisters at their side, ready to unleash devastation upon their brother Legion. Bjorn stood among the landing parties as they deployed into Tizca, the jeweled city of the Thousand Suns. What he witnessed in those opening moments would haunt him for millennia to come. The Thousand Suns, forbidden from using their powers to defend themselves by Magnus's own command, died in droves. They stood in neat formations, waiting for orders that would never come, as bolter fire cut them down. The burning of their libraries, each containing knowledge painstakingly gathered over decades, sent towers of smoke spiraling into Prospero's sky. The screams of civilians caught in the crossfire echoed through streets that had known nothing but peaceful scholarship for generations. It was slaughter, not war, and something in Bjorn's soul recoiled from it even as his training drove him forward. The true horror awaited in the depths of Tizca's temples, where chaos had already begun to corrupt the fabric of reality. As Bjorn moved through corridors filled with eldritch energy, he found himself confronting something that should not exist in the material world. A demon, wearing the face of Horus Lupercal, the War Master himself. The creature had taken advantage of the psychic upheaval on Prospero to manifest, and it knew things, terrible things. Yet it knew the true names of the space wolves who confronted it, and with those names came power over them. Bjorn watched his packmates fall, overwhelmed by the demon's knowledge of their true selves. One by one, they succumbed to powers that turned their own identities against them. But when the demon attempted to claim Bjorn, using the name Bear that the conservator Horsa had called him by, it found no purchase. For Bear was not his true name. It was a translation, an approximation in Low Gothic of his actual name. The demon's power slid off him like water off steel. In the chaos of that confrontation, as the demon's eldritch flames consumed Bjorn's left arm, Horsa himself acted. The conservator, finally freed from the influence that had been using him, took up an axe and severed Bjorn's arm at the elbow, as saving the warrior's life even as he damned him to carry a permanent reminder of this day. The arrival of Dreadnoughts and Silent Sisters turned the tide, their null presence banishing the demon back into the warp, but the damage was done. Bjorn emerged from the temple with his arm gone, his brothers dead, and his soul marked by the knowledge of what they had done to the Thousand Sons. Other accounts suggest slightly different circumstances for the loss of his arm. Some speak of psychic feedback from a sorcerer he had slain, the dying curse of 1,000 Sons Psyker lashing out in desperation. Others mention Constantin Valdor, the captain general of the Adeptus Custodes, severing the corrupted limb to prevent the taint from spreading. The truth, like so much from that dark day, has been obscured by time and conflicting recollections. What cannot be disputed is that Bjorn left Prospero changed. The loss of his arm was merely the physical manifestation of something deeper. He had witnessed the horror of what happens when space marines turn upon each other in earnest. He had seen knowledge that took centuries to accumulate burned away in hours. He had felt the presence of the warp in ways that no warrior should experience. And somewhere in the depths of his being, a seed of doubt had been planted about the righteousness of what they had done. The Space Wolves called him Bjorn One-Handed in the aftermath, a title he initially wore with bitter pride. It stood for all of them, he insisted, all of them who had been maimed by Prospero, body or soul. The Iron Priests fashioned a mechanical replacement, a crude augmetic hand, but Bjorn rejected it. Instead, he kept the wolf claw he had stolen years before, using it now not out of convenience, but as a permanent reminder of what Prospero had cost. Leman Russ himself took notice of the young warrior who had survived where others had fallen, who had resisted the demon's power through an accident of linguistics. There was something about Bjorn, some quality of stubborn endurance that impressed the Wolf King. But the true test, the moment that would define Bjorn's legend, was yet to come. The Lone Wolf's Oath. The wound of Prospero had barely begun to heal when the Space Wolves found themselves committed to another campaign, another battle in the endless crusade to reunify humanity under the Emperor's banner. The world of Grith, a volcanic hellscape where the air itself seemed to burn, had become infested with the forces of chaos. Demons walked openly upon its surface, and at their head marched a creature of particular horror. Arvax the Arch-Slaughterer, a greater demon of Horn, whose kill count was legendary even among the blood gods chosen. The Space Wolves deployed to cleanse this taint, and Bjorn's pack was assigned to lead the assault where resistance was expected to be heaviest. They were veterans by this point, his packmates. Warriors who had fought beside him through countless battles, who knew his moods and his methods, who had adjusted their tactics to accommodate his calculating approach to combat. Together, they had humbled tyrants and butchered Xenos beyond counting. They had even faced and killed traitor space marines, their own erstwhile brothers who had fallen from the Emperor's grace during the opening stages of the Horus heresy. And they were the elite of the elite, and they believed themselves ready for anything. They were wrong. Arvax, the arch-slaughterer, was not merely powerful. He was a force of nature, a being whose very existence was an affront to the material universe. When Bjorn and his pack encountered the demon, they fought with all the skill and fury that had made the space wolves feared throughout the galaxy. Their bolters spoke death, their chainswords sang songs of slaughter. Bjorn's wolf-claw flashed in the volcanic light as he tore at the demon's brass hide. But it was not enough. It would never be enough. One by one, his brothers fell. The warrior who had stood at his right hand for 20 years died with the demon's axe buried in his chest. The brother who had pulled him from the rubble during the siege of Monarchia was torn in half by hands that could crush ceramite like parchment. The packmate, who had shared his first drink as a fully fledged space wolf, was beheaded with casual disdain. Bjorn fought on, driven by desperation and rage, but even his considerable skill meant nothing against a creature of Arvax's caliber. He should have died there. By all rights, his skull should have joined those of his brothers, crushed beneath the demon's heel. But fate, or perhaps something darker, had other plans. The arrival of Leman Russ himself, leading a counterattack with his wolf guard, turned the tide of battle. The Primarch's presence was like lightning made manifest, his fury matching and exceeding even that of the demon. Together, the space wolves drove Arvax back, banishing the creature back into the warp from whence it came. But Bjorn took no joy in the victory. He stood among the pyres where his packmates burned, surrounded by the scent of burning flesh and the keening cries of mourning, and something inside him broke. Not his spirit, not his will to fight, but something fundamental about who he was and what he believed. He had survived when better warriors had fallen. He had lived when those he loved had died. The injustice of it, the sheer random cruelty of it, filled him with an anger so cold and deep that it seemed to freeze the very marrow of his bones. In that moment, standing before the victory pyres, Bjorn gave voice to an oath, a howl of pain and rage and determination that silenced even the celebration of the other space wolves. He swore vengeance upon Arvax, that he vowed that he would hunt the demon across the galaxy if necessary, that he would face the creature again and see it destroyed utterly. Until that oath was fulfilled, he declared, no ale would pass his lips. No feast would see his presence. No comfort or pleasure would be his. He would be a lone wolf, the first to bear that title in the history of the Legion, walking a path of vengeance until either his oath was satisfied or death claimed him. The other space wolves witnessed this oath with a mixture of respect and unease. To walk alone, to separate oneself from the pack, went against every instinct that defined the Vlaika Fenrika. They were pack warriors, bound by oaths of brotherhood and kinship. A lone wolf was an aberration, a failure, but none dared question Bjorn's right to seek his vengeance. Yet he had earned it with the blood of his brothers. He had paid for it with his survival. For 5 years, Bjorn hunted. He tracked rumors of Arvax across a dozen star systems. He followed the trail of slaughter that marked the demon's passage through the material realm. He fought in battles where he was the only space wolf present, lending his skills to other Imperial forces in exchange for information or transport. The cold anger that drove him never wavered, never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing month, feeding on his isolation and his determination. When word finally came that Arvax had manifested again, Bjorn did not wait for orders or permission. He simply went, driven by an imperative that transcended duty or discipline, and fate, cruel and capricious, I had delivered him to his enemy before even Leman Russ could arrive. The duel that followed entered legend. Bjorn, alone and burning with 5 years of accumulated fury, faced the demon that had slaughtered his pack. The details vary in the telling. Some say the battle lasted for hours, that Bjorn matched the demon blow for blow until both were exhausted. Others claim it was over in moments, that Bjorn's cold precision found the weakness in Arvax's defenses before the demon even realized the danger. What is certain is that Bjorn, wielding his trusty wolf claw, climbed the demon's massive form and tore out its throat, banishing Arvax back to the warp with such violence that the creature would not dare manifest again for millennia. Leman Russ arrived in time to witness the end of this confrontation. The Wolf King, who had been racing to face Arvax himself, watched his young warrior achieve what even a Primarch would have struggled to accomplish. In that moment, Russ saw in Bjorn something he had not fully recognized before. Not just skill or courage, which were common enough among his sons, but something rarer. A strength born of loss, a determination forged in the fires of tragedy, a will that could endure the unbearable and emerge unbroken. In the aftermath of the battle, before the assembled Space Wolves, Leman Russ formally exonerated Bjorn of his oath. His kinsmen were avenged, his duty was fulfilled. But the Wolf King did not stop there. He promoted Bjorn to his personal Wolf Guard, the most elite warriors of the Legion, those who fought at the Primarch's own side, and he gave him a new name, no longer Bjorn One-Handed, as that bitter reminder of Prospero's shame. From this day forward, he would be known as Bjorn the Fell-Handed, a title that spoke of deadly determination, of the hand that brought doom to the enemies of the Imperium, of the warrior whose claw had torn out a demon's throat. The precedent he set that day would endure for 10,000 years. Future generations of space wolves who lost their packs, who found themselves the sole survivors of some catastrophe, would take up the title of Lone Wolf. They would swear oaths of vengeance and walk alone into battle, seeking either to fulfill their vows or to die in the attempt. And always, they would look back to Bjorn as the first, the one who showed them the way. The Wolf King's shadow. As a member of Leman Russ's Wolf Guard, Bjorn found himself thrust into the highest levels of the Space Wolves' command structure. He fought in battles that shaped the course of the Horus heresy. He stood at his Primarch's side during moments that would echo through history. And through it all, his cold anger, that fury born on Gryth and tempered by years of solitary vengeance, never left him. If anything, it grew more refined, more focused, until it became simply part of who he was. Not a destructive force, but a tool he wielded with the same precision as his claw. The Battle of the Alaxes. Nebula tested the Space Wolves in ways that Prospero never had. Ambushed by the Alpha Legion in the aftermath of the burning, the Wolves found themselves fighting a foe who knew their tactics, who anticipated their strategies. Who matched them, blow for blow, with a cunning that bordered on prescience. Bjorn defended his ship, the Hellridder, against Alpha Legion boarders with characteristic efficiency. Then, realizing that his Primarch was in danger aboard the flagship Hraffenkel, he led his remaining warriors through void-torn corridors and enemy fire to reach Russ's side. They arrived just in time to see Leman Russ locked in combat with a traitor Contemptor Dreadnought, one of the massive walking war machines that the Alpha Legion had somehow infiltrated onto the flagship. Bjorn did not hesitate. He threw himself at the Contemptor with a fury that shocked even the other Space Wolves. It was suicide, a mortal warrior facing a Dreadnought with nothing but a bolt pistol and a power claw. But Bjorn fought with such ferocity, with such complete disregard for his own survival, that he actually managed to damage the war machine before Russ intervened and destroyed it. In the aftermath of that battle, as the Space Wolves licked their wounds and prepared to continue hunting the traitors, Bjorn found his Primarch in a state he had never witnessed before. Despair. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, the Emperor's executioner, sat among the wreckage and questioned everything. They had been manipulated, used, turned into weapons against their own brothers. The burning of Prospero, which had seemed so clear and righteous at the time, now appeared tainted by the very corruption they thought they were fighting against. It was Bjorn who spoke then, not with carefully crafted words of comfort or tactical assessments of their situation, but with simple, brutal honesty. But they could not change what they had done, could not undo Prospero or bring back the 1,000 sons they had killed. But they could choose what they became in the wake of that tragedy. They could be more than the Emperor's executioners, more than weapons pointed at whatever target the throne deemed appropriate. They could forge their own path, guided by their own judgment, while still serving the Imperium. Those words, spoken by a warrior who had himself been forged by tragedy and loss, reached Leman Russ when nothing else could have. The Primarch rose from his despair, not unchanged by what had happened, but no longer paralyzed by it. And he never forgot the young Wolfguard who had possessed the courage to speak truth to a Primarch's face. Later, after the heresy's end, Bjorn accompanied Russ to Fenris for a ritual that remains shrouded in mystery. At a place called Searcher's Door, where the veil between the material realm and something else grew thin, Russ prepared to enter what the Space Wolves called the Underverse. He took 9 rune priests with him, including Kovar, one of the chapter's most powerful psykers, and he gave Bjorn a simple command. Do not turn around. No matter what you hear, no matter what you sense, do not turn around until I return. So, Bjorn stood vigil, his back to the door, as Leman Russ ventured into realms beyond mortal comprehension. Behind him, he heard the rune priests beginning to scream. One by one, they fell to demonic possession or worse, their souls claimed by entities that had slipped through the weakened veil. Kava, who had been like a brother to Bjorn, begged for help in a voice that was no longer entirely his own. The temptation to turn, to fight, to save them was almost overwhelming, but Bjorn did not turn. His cold anger, that fury that had sustained him through Grith and the long years of his lone wolf oath, gave him the strength to endure. He stood like a statue of adamantium, refusing to acknowledge the horror behind him, trusting in his Primarch's command, even as everything in him screamed to act. When Russ finally emerged, followed by Dreadnoughts and Silent Sisters who had come to contain the breach, 8 rune priests were dead or worse. Only Bjorn remained, his back still turned, his duty fulfilled. In the years that followed the heresy, Bjorn threw himself into the work of rebuilding the Imperium with an intensity that impressed even Leman Russ. While other Space Marines struggled with the trauma of the war that had torn the Imperium apart, Bjorn seemed to channel his experiences into pure determination. He believed in the Imperium's mission. He believed in the Emperor's vision, even if he no longer believed that vision could be achieved through the simple application of overwhelming force. The galaxy needed to be rebuilt, needed to be secured against the threats that pressed in from all sides, and Bjorn would dedicate himself to that task with the same single-minded focus he had brought to his hunt for Arvax. This dedication did not go unnoticed. Leman Russ, preparing for a journey whose purpose he shared with no one, made his final dispositions for the Space Wolves. He gathered his Wolfguard, his most trusted companions, and told them he was leaving. Not permanently, as he assured them, he would return when the time was right, when the galaxy needed him most. But for now, he had a task that required his personal attention, and he would undertake it alone, or rather, almost alone. He took his Wolfguard with him, all of them except one. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the warrior who had earned his name through tragedy and determination, who had stood at Russ's side through the darkest days of the heresy, was left behind. No explanation was given, no reason offered. Russ simply looked at his youngest Wolfguard and told him he would understand someday why he had to remain when the others departed. The rejection burned in Bjorn's soul like acid. After everything he had done, after all he had sacrificed and endured, he was being left behind like a child deemed too young for the adult's business. Yet he watched as Russ departed into the Eye of Terror with the rest of his Wolfguard, and he felt the old anger returning. Not the hot fury that consumed common warriors, but that cold, deep rage that had defined him since Grith. But now, it had a new target. Not demons or traitors or Xenos threats, but abandonment itself. The fundamental unfairness of being chosen to bear a burden he had never asked for. Years later, through decades of contemplation and the unique perspective that comes from being entombed in a dreadnought, Bjorn would come to believe he understood Russ's reasoning. The Wolf King had seen in him a quality that none of the other Wolf Guard possessed. Not greater skill or stronger faith, but the ability to endure isolation. To stand vigil alone when all others had fallen or fled, or to carry on when carrying on seemed impossible. Russ had needed someone who could lead the Space Wolves through the dark centuries to come, someone whose cold anger would keep them focused and sane when hope seemed lost. Someone who would not give up, could not give up, because surrender was simply not in his nature. But at the time, in the immediate aftermath of Russ's departure, Bjorn felt only betrayal and abandonment, and he channeled those feelings into duty, as he always had. The first great wolf. The Space Wolves waited. For 7 long years, they maintained Leman Russ's seat at every feast, filled his drinking horn at every celebration, and hoped that each dawn would bring their Primarch's return. The chapter continued its operations, of course. Wars did not pause for sentiment. And the Imperium still had need of the Emperor's executioners, but there was a sense of incompleteness, of waiting for a story's ending that refused to come. After 7 years, the Wolf Lords could wait no longer. The Imperium needed leadership. The chapter needed direction. And so they gathered and elected Bjorn as their leader, naming him the first Great Wolf, the first to hold the position of chapter master in Leman Russ's absence.
You know, there's something profoundly tragic about Bjorn's story that really resonates with me. Here's a warrior who has given everything to the Imperium. His body, his autonomy, even his ability to simply exist without purpose. And yet he endures, not because he wants to, but because he believes he must. I think that's what makes Bjorn so compelling as a character. He's not some gleaming hero who embraces his fate with joy. He's bitter, he's angry, he resents what's been done to him, but he serves anyway, because duty means something to him that transcends personal happiness or comfort. In a setting as grim as Warhammer 40k, where most characters are either fanatical zealots or cartoonishly evil, Bjorn stands out as genuinely human. He's someone who has suffered for 10,000 years and still chooses to keep going, not because he's mindless or brainwashed, but because he made a choice long ago about who he wanted to be. That's the kind of tragedy that sticks with you. But anyway, let's continue.
It was not an honor Bjorn sought. In his heart, he still burned with resentment at being left behind, still felt the sting of Russ's decision like a fresh wound. But duty had always trumped personal feeling for him, and so he accepted the responsibility without complaint or celebration. His first act as Great Wolf was to announce the Great Hunt. If Leman Russ would not return to them, and then they would go and find him. The 12 great companies of the Space Wolves would take to their ships and sail forth across the sea of stars in different directions, each seeking any trace of their lost Primarch. They would search the Eye of Terror itself if necessary. They would turn over every stone in the galaxy if that was what it took, and they would not stop until Russ was found or the end of days arrived. It was a grand gesture, the kind of dramatic quest that appealed to the Space Wolves' sense of legend and glory. But it was also practical. It gave the chapter purpose beyond mere combat operations. It provided a unifying goal that transcended the individual ambitions of the Wolf Lords. And perhaps most importantly, it ensured that the Space Wolves would remain spread throughout the galaxy, ready to respond to threats wherever they emerged, rather than concentrating in one region. As Great Wolf, Bjorn proved to be an effective, if unconventional, leader. His cold, calculating approach to warfare complemented the Space Wolves' innate ferocity, tempering their aggression with tactical acumen. He led from the front, as was expected of a Space Wolf commander, but he also planned for contingencies and fallback positions. His experiences during the Heresy had taught him that even the best warriors could be defeated through superior strategy, and he was determined that the Space Wolves would not fall victim to such tactics. But leading the chapter also required political skills that did not come naturally to him. The Space Wolves, despite their reputation for boisterousness and lack of refinement, they had to navigate the complex web of imperial politics. They had to maintain relationships with other Space Marine chapters, coordinate with the Imperial Guard and Navy, deal with the Administratum's endless bureaucracy, and occasionally handle the delicate egos of planetary governors who thought their local problems deserved immediate attention from the Emperor's finest. Bjorn handled these responsibilities with the same blunt honesty that had characterized his earlier career. He did not suffer fools gladly, did not waste time on elaborate courtesies when direct speech would suffice, and had little patience for those who put personal ambition ahead of the Imperium's needs. This approach won him respect from some quarters and enmity from others, but it was undeniably effective. And the Space Wolves under Bjorn's leadership remained one of the most feared and respected chapters in the Imperium. The years of his tenure as Great Wolf saw countless campaigns and victories. The precise details of many have been lost to time, but the broad strokes remain in the chapter's records. Bjorn led the Space Wolves in battles against every major threat the Imperium faced in that turbulent age. Greenskin hordes, Eldar raiders, Chaos incursions, all fell before the fury of the wolves under his command. His strategic decisions saved countless Imperial worlds, and his tactical innovations became part of the Space Wolves' standard doctrine. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Bjorn's time as Great Wolf was the precedent he set for how the chapter would function in Russ's absence. He established traditions that would endure for 10,000 years. He codified the role of the Great Wolf not as a replacement for the Primarch, but as a steward, a caretaker who maintained Russ's legacy until the day of his return. This distinction was crucial. It meant that every Great Wolf who followed would see themselves as temporary, as guardians of something that ultimately belonged to another. It prevented the kind of empire building and dynasty creation that plagued other chapters whose Primarchs had disappeared. The Proxima Rebellion, in the year 934 of the 31st Millennium, would mark the end of Bjorn's service as Great Wolf, though he could not have known it at the time. The rebellion was a complex affair, involving corrupted Imperial officials, Chaos cultists, and possibly even Alpha Legion infiltrators. The Space Wolves were called in to restore order, and Bjorn led a strike force personally to liberate Battle Brothers, who had been trapped in the notorious Dreadsun Fortress. The fortress was a nightmare of overlapping kill zones and defensive positions, designed by some forgotten genius of siege warfare to be virtually impregnable. But the Space Wolves were not known for accepting impossibilities. Bjorn's forces breached the outer walls, fought through corridors that ran red with blood, and reached their trapped brothers before the fortress's defenders could execute them. It should have been a triumph, a rescue mission that would add another glorious chapter to Bjorn's saga. Instead, it became the moment when his mortal body failed him. The details vary in the telling, as they so often do with events from that ancient age. Or some accounts speak of a trap sprung just as the rescue seemed successful, explosives or hidden weapons that caught Bjorn in their blast. Others describe a desperate last stand, where Bjorn held a vital position alone while his brothers escaped, taking wounds that should have killed him outright. What is certain is that when the Space Wolves finally extracted their leader from the Dreadsun Fortress, his body was shattered beyond anything the Wolf Priests could repair. His spine was broken. His internal organs had sustained massive trauma. One leg was crushed beyond recognition. The damage was catastrophic, the kind of injuries that would have killed even a Space Marine within minutes, if not for immediate medical intervention. The Wolf Priests worked frantically to stabilize him, but they knew the truth. Bjorn's body was dying. Yet no amount of surgery or augmentation could change that fundamental reality. But his spirit still burned bright. Beneath the ruined flesh, Bjorn's consciousness remained intact, his will to fight undiminished by mere physical limitations. To allow such a warrior to simply die seemed like a waste of resources the Imperium could ill afford, and so they made a choice that would define the rest of Bjorn's existence: a choice that was both salvation and damnation, wrapped together in adamantium and ceramite. They would entomb him in a dreadnought, entombed in iron. The dreadnought sarcophagus they prepared for Bjorn was no ordinary war machine. The iron priests of the Space Wolves, understanding that they were working with the last living link to Leman Russ, poured their considerable skills into creating something extraordinary. It was a Mark V dreadnought, heavily modified and enhanced with technology that was rare even during the Horus Heresy. The sarcophagus at its heart was designed to interface with Bjorn's nervous system in ways that allowed for faster reaction times and better sensory input than standard dreadnoughts could manage. The chassis was decorated with wolf skulls and sacred runes, every surface covered in totems and talismans that spoke to Bjorn's legend. He hated it. From the moment consciousness returned and Bjorn found himself entombed within the walking war machine, he hated every aspect of what had been done to him. The ornamentation that the Iron Priests had lavished upon his chassis struck him as grotesque, a crude attempt to humanize what was fundamentally inhuman. The enhanced sensory systems, which were supposed to allow him to fight by instinct as he always had, felt like a poor substitute for actual sensory experience. And the very act of existing as a consciousness trapped within metal, unable to feel the wind, or taste food, or know the simple pleasure of movement without mechanical intermediation, was a torment beyond anything he had experienced before. If he had been given a choice, Bjorn might have refused the procedure. Death, after all, would have been a release, an ending to a story that had already contained more than its share of tragedy and sacrifice. But the choice had not been his to make. The wolf priests had acted out of a desire to preserve a valuable asset, yes, but also out of genuine concern for a warrior they respected. They believed they were honoring him, at giving him a chance to continue serving the chapter he loved even after his mortal body had failed. They could not have understood, could not have known, what they were really doing. For Bjorn, the transition from flesh to metal was not elevation, but damnation. He was not saved. He was trapped, condemned to an existence that was neither life nor death, but something in between, a consciousness bound to a machine, until either it or he finally broke beyond all repair. The anger that had defined him since Gryth, that cold fury that had sustained him through loss and betrayal, found a new target. He raged against his imprisonment, against the well-meaning priests who had done this to him, against Leman Russ, who had left him behind to endure this fate alone, against the very universe that seemed determined to deny him the clean ending he had earned a dozen times over. But duty remained. Whatever his personal feelings, whatever his private anguish, Bjorn was still a space wolf, still a warrior of the Imperium. And if the Emperor's servants believed his continued service was necessary, then he would serve. Not because he wanted to, not because he accepted what had been done to him, but because surrender, even to the justified despair of his situation, was not in his nature. So he fought. For 500 years, Bjorn remained at the forefront of battle. He led crusades against enemies of the Imperium across countless worlds. His assault cannon, which he wielded with the same precision he had once brought to his bolter, carved through enemy formations like a scythe through wheat. His power claw, or the true claw as it came to be known, was fashioned by the Iron Priests in honor of his favored weapon from his mortal days. It could tear through armor plating and fortified positions with equal ease, and in Bjorn's hands, it became a tool of calculated destruction that inspired fear in enemies and awe in allies. His kill count during this period was staggering. By some estimates, Bjorn personally eliminated more enemies than some entire chapters managed during the same span. He defeated the demon Thran Saba on Algol 7, banishing it back to the warp with such violence that it did not dare manifest again for millennia. He crushed the greenskin warlord Makrin in the deserts of Quarren, grinding the beast's forces into dust through a campaign that showcased his tactical brilliance. He ended the Thranks rebellion by killing the rogue psyker Vornalan, whose powers had corrupted an entire sector before Bjorn's intervention. These victories, and countless others like them, established Bjorn's reputation as one of the most deadly warriors in the Imperium. But they also took their toll, not on his physical form, which required maintenance but could be repaired by skilled tech marines, but on his consciousness. The constant cycle of awakening for battle, fighting until victory was achieved, then returning to stasis sleep, began to erode something fundamental about who he was. Sleep for a dreadnought is not like mortal rest. It is a void, an absence of consciousness so complete that time becomes meaningless. When Bjorn entered stasis, he did not dream, did not think, simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way until the moment he was reactivated. At first, this was a mercy. The blessed oblivion of non-existence was preferable to dwelling on his fate. But as the decades turned to centuries, something changed. Bjorn began to notice that each awakening felt different, not in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts of perspective and memory. Details from his mortal life grew hazy. The faces of his packmates, which had once been clear enough to bring pain, became indistinct shadows. The sound of Leman Russ's voice, which he had once been able to recall perfectly, started to fade like an echo growing distant. He was losing himself, piece by piece, to the mechanical nature of his existence. The realization filled him with a new kind of horror. It was one thing to be trapped in a walking tomb, conscious but limited in physical sensation. It was another thing entirely to feel your very identity beginning to erode, to know that you were slowly becoming less than you had been, that the machine was consuming not just your body, but your essential self. Bjorn fought against this dissolution with the same stubborn determination he had brought to every other challenge in his life, but he could not stop it, could only slow it, could only cling to the memories and experiences that defined him with increasing desperation as they threatened to slip away entirely. This was when Bjorn began to truly understand why Leman Russ had left him behind. His cold anger, that fury which had sustained him through so much, was the key. It kept him sane when sanity should have been impossible. It gave him an anchor point and a core of identity that could not be eroded by the passage of time or the limitations of his mechanical form. Russ had seen this quality in him, had understood that of all his Wolfguard, only Bjorn possessed the temperament necessary to endure the centuries as a dreadnought without going mad or losing himself entirely to the machine. It was not forgiveness. Bjorn still burned with resentment at being chosen for this burden. But it was understanding, and that understanding allowed him to accept what had been done to him, if not to embrace it. He was the guardian of the Space Wolves across the generations, the living memory of a time when the Primarchs walked among men and the Emperor still guided humanity directly. This was his purpose. This was why he had been left behind. As the toll of centuries mounted, Bjorn found himself requiring longer and longer periods of stasis sleep between deployments. The Wolf Priests, recognizing both the value of their ancient warrior and the danger of overusing him, began to wake him only when his presence was truly necessary. Major battles, critical decisions, moments when the chapter's very survival hung in the balance. These were the occasions that justified rousing Bjorn from his tomb. All other times, he slept, preserved in stasis until he was needed again. Eventually, a tradition was formalized. Bjorn would be awakened once every 1,000 years, or whenever the chapter faced a crisis that required his skills and wisdom. And once each century, he would be roused to attend the Great Feast, that boisterous celebration where the Space Wolves gathered to honor their lost Primarch and reaffirm their oaths. At these feasts, Bjorn would speak. He would tell stories of the old days, when Russ walked among them. He would share memories of the Emperor, of the Great Crusade, of battles and brothers long since turned to dust. And in doing so, he kept the chapter's oral tradition alive, maintained that vital link to their origins that made them more than just warriors, but inheritors of a legendary past. The Ancients' Rest and Awakening. Deep within the Fang, the fortress monastery that serves as the Space Wolves' home, there exists a chamber known to few outside the chapter. It is not marked on any map accessible to outsiders, not mentioned in any official records that might fall into unauthorized hands. This is the Hall of the Revered Fallen, where the Space Wolves' dreadnoughts rest between battles. Here, as in alcoves carved from living rock and lined with sacred metals, the ancient warriors sleep away the centuries in stasis. Bjorn's sarcophagus occupies a place of honor in this hall. It is larger than the others, more ornately decorated, surrounded by totems and offerings placed by generations of space wolves who have come to pay their respects. Each day, the Iron Priests come to perform the sacred rituals of maintenance, anointing the sarcophagus with blessed oils and checking the systems that keep Bjorn's consciousness stable across the vast gulfs of time. They work in reverent silence, understanding that they are tending to something more than just a weapon, more even than a hero. They are maintaining a living connection to an age of legend. The process of awakening Bjorn has itself become a ritual steeped in tradition, and it begins with a decision made at the highest levels of chapter leadership. The current Great Wolf, after consulting with the Wolf Priests and his most trusted advisors, determines that the time has come to wake the eldest. Perhaps a threat has emerged that requires ancient wisdom to counter. Perhaps the chapter faces a decision whose implications reach across centuries, and they need the perspective of one who has witnessed 10,000 years of Imperial history. Or perhaps it is simply time for the Great Feast, when Bjorn will share his memories with a new generation of space wolves. Once the decision is made, a delegation of Iron Priests enters the Hall of the Revered Fallen. They approach Bjorn's sarcophagus with the reverence due to both a superior officer and a sacred relic. Prayers are spoken in the tongue of Fenris. Are you asking that the ancient warrior return from his slumber intact and ready to serve once more? Then, with practiced movements honed by centuries of tradition, they begin the awakening sequence. Systems that have been dormant for decades or even centuries come online one by one. Power cells charge, filling the sarcophagus with energy. Stasis fields collapse, allowing time to reassert its claim on the consciousness within. Neural interfaces reconnect, bridging the gap between organic brain and mechanical systems. It is a delicate process, one that must be performed with utmost precision. Rush it, and the shock of awakening could cause catastrophic damage. Proceed too slowly, and the consciousness within might slip back into stasis before fully returning to awareness. For Bjorn, the experience of awakening is always disorienting. One moment, there is nothing. The void of non-existence, comfortable in its complete absence of sensation or thought. The next moment, existence returns like a thunderclap. Suddenly, he is again, conscious, aware, trapped within the metal shell that has been his prison for 9 millennia. The weight of time crashes down upon him, all those centuries of lost opportunity and stolen life made manifest in an instant of terrible clarity. His first thought, every time, is to question why. Why have they awakened him? Why can they not simply let him sleep? Sleep is peace. Sleep is the only mercy granted to those who have been entombed in dreadnoughts, the brief respite from the awareness of their fate. To be pulled from that oblivion feels like cruelty, even though he understands the necessity intellectually, emotionally, viscerally, or he wants nothing more than to return to the darkness. But he does not voice these thoughts. The ritual demands certain responses, certain acknowledgements. So Bjorn's voice, amplified through voxcasters that turn his words into thunder, rolls out across the chamber. Who awakens Bjorn? The question is formal, part of the ritual that has grown up around his awakening. He already knows who has come, can identify them through his optical sensors. But the form must be maintained. The Iron Priest responds, identifying himself and stating the reason for Bjorn's awakening. The words vary depending on circumstances, but they always carry the same underlying message. You are needed. The chapter requires your service once more. And Bjorn, because duty has always transcended personal desire in his life, responds as he always has. And he accepts the burden. He acknowledges the necessity. He prepares himself to serve. The journey from the Hall of the Revered Fallen to wherever Bjorn is needed becomes a procession. As word spreads that the eldest has awakened, space wolves gather to witness his passage. Blood Claws, those young and fierce warriors fresh from their initiation, stand in silent awe as the massive Dreadnought passes. Grey Hunters, the veteran warriors who form the chapter's backbone, offer salutes of respect. Even Wolf Lords, those mighty commanders who lead entire great companies, pause in their duties to acknowledge Bjorn's presence. For many of these warriors, it is the first time they have seen Bjorn in person. Entire generations of space wolves can live and die without ever witnessing the ancient warrior's awakening. But to be present when he walks among them is considered a rare privilege, a moment they will remember and recount for the rest of their lives. They see in him not just a powerful weapon or a legendary hero, but a living bridge to the age of their Primarch. Bjorn fought beside Leman Russ. He saw the Emperor with his own eyes. He was there during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. To these younger warriors, Bjorn represents something almost mythical, made tangible. When Bjorn is awakened for the Great Feast, rather than for war, the ceremony takes on a different character. The Great Hall of the Fang is prepared with all the grandeur befitting such an occasion. Tables groan under the weight of meat and drink. Warriors from all 12 great companies gather, their voices raised in songs and sagas. The atmosphere is boisterous, celebratory, filled with the kind of joy and camaraderie that defines the Space Wolves at their best. Then, Bjorn arrives, and silence descends like a physical force. The massive Dreadnought enters the hall, his footsteps shaking the very floor. The great wolf rises from his seat, the seat that traditionally belongs to Leman Russ himself, and cedes it to the ancient warrior. Not literally, of course. Bjorn cannot sit in a chair designed for human proportions. But symbolically, in that moment, he becomes the highest authority present. The voice of the past speaking to the present. What follows is storytelling of a kind rarely seen in the Imperium. Bjorn speaks of the old days with the authority of one who was there. He describes battles fought before any of his listeners were born, recounts decisions made by warriors whose names have passed into legend. Yet he speaks of Leman Russ, not as a distant figure of myth, but as a commander he knew personally. He shares memories of the Emperor, describes what it was like to stand in the presence of the master of mankind, when he still walked among his people. These are not dry recitations of historical fact. Bjorn is a storyteller in the finest Fenrisian tradition, and he knows how to craft a narrative that grips his audience. He pauses for effect, modulates his mechanical voice to convey emotion, chooses details that bring the past to life in the imaginations of his listeners. For those hours while Bjorn speaks, the space wolves gathered in the Great Hall can almost believe they are back in the age of legend themselves, fighting alongside heroes whose equals will never be seen again. But there is also a melancholy to these occasions that Bjorn himself feels most acutely. Each time he awakens, he notices changes. The faces are different, of course. The warriors who listened to his last tale have either died in battle or, in the rare cases of extreme longevity, been promoted to positions where they no longer attend such gatherings. The traditions have evolved, shifted in subtle ways that accumulate over the centuries until the chapter he returns to is recognizably different from the one he left. More disturbing are the gaps in his own memory. Details that he once recalled with perfect clarity now elude him. Events blur together, separated by so much time and so many periods of stasis sleep that he can no longer be certain which happened first. He finds himself embellishing stories to cover these gaps, yet not from any desire to deceive, but simply because the alternative is to admit that the living memory of the Space Wolves' past is itself failing, eroding like everything else in the galaxy's slow march toward entropy. Sometimes, usually late in the evening, when the feast has gone on for hours and ale has loosened tongues, younger warriors will approach Bjorn with questions. They are respectful, of course. One does not show disrespect to the eldest, but they are also curious, burning with desire to know details about the age of their Primarch. What was Leman Russ really like? Did the Emperor truly possess the power the legends attribute to him? What was the greatest battle Bjorn ever fought? What advice would he give to those who must defend the Imperium in this dark age? Bjorn answers these questions with varying degrees of patience, depending on his mood and the nature of the inquiry. Thoughtful questions that show genuine understanding of the past receive detailed responses. Foolish queries that reveal ignorance or lack of thought are met with the kind of withering commentary that sends the questioner slinking away in embarrassment. And questions that touch on painful subjects, like Russ's disappearance or the events of Prospero, are answered with a careful honesty that neither glorifies nor condemns, but simply states what happened and leaves interpretation to the listener. But always, underlying every word he speaks and every interaction he has with his younger brothers, is the awareness of what he has lost. Bjorn is not one of them anymore, has not been for 9,000 years. He is apart and isolated by the sheer weight of time and the inhuman nature of his existence. They look at him and see a legend. He looks at them and sees echoes, reflections of brothers who died millennia ago, fighting battles whose causes have long since been forgotten. The connection he once felt to the Space Wolves, that sense of belonging to a pack, has been eroded by centuries until what remains is duty and memory and little else. When the feast ends, when the stories have been told and the warriors return to their duties, Bjorn is escorted back to the Hall of the Revered Fallen. The Iron Priests prepare him for stasis once more. Systems power down. The neural interface disconnects. The blessing of oblivion approaches once again. And Bjorn, rather than regretting this return to sleep, welcomes it. In sleep, there is no awareness of loss, no consciousness of being trapped, no weight of impossible expectations and fading memories. There is only peace. The Battle of the Fang. In the year 32,000 of the 32nd Millennium, Magnus the Red returned to Fenris seeking vengeance. The demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns had not forgotten the burning of Prospero, that day when the Space Wolves had descended upon his world and destroyed everything he had built. For 1,000 years, he had planned his retaliation, preparing a strike that would not merely hurt the Space Wolves, but cripple them permanently. He would steal their gene seed, corrupt their very source of future warriors, and ensure that the wolves could never produce successor chapters. And he would do it on Fenris itself, in the heart of the Fang, as a final humiliation. Magnus's timing was exquisite, and through manipulation and foresight, he had ensured that 11 of the Space Wolves' 12 great companies were away from Fenris when his attack began. The Fang was defended by only a skeleton garrison, one great company of Astartes supplemented by chapter serfs and mortal auxiliaries. Against a full-scale invasion by the Thousand Suns and their demonic allies, these defenders should have been overwhelmed in hours, perhaps days at most. But Magnus had failed to account for the Revered Fallen. Deep in their halls, the Space Wolves' ancient dreadnoughts slumbered in stasis. Among them, Bjorn the Fell-Handed waited in his eternal sleep. And when the invasion began, when Magnus's sorcerous powers tore reality apart and allowed demons to pour into the Fang's corridors, Jarl Greylock made a decision that would define the battle to come. He ordered Bjorn's awakening. The process was rushed, performed under combat conditions rather than the measured ritual that usually accompanied the ancient warrior's revival. Iron priests worked frantically as explosions shook the very stone around them, as reality itself seemed to come apart at the seams under the pressure of Magnus's assault. Power cells charged, stasis fields collapsed, neural interfaces connected with desperate haste, and Bjorn, dragged from his sleep by the urgent necessity of the moment, awoke into chaos. His first awareness was of anger. Not the cold, calculated fury that usually defined him, but something hotter, more immediate. He had been awakened, yes, but no one had thought to consult him before sending 11/12 of the chapter on a single deployment. Such tactical foolishness would never have been tolerated in his day. What great wolf had approved such a concentration of force, leaving Fenris itself vulnerable, The strategic incompetence of it offended every tactical instinct Bjorn possessed. But personal anger had to be set aside. The situation briefing made the severity of the crisis clear. Magnus the Red, ascended to demonhood and wielding powers that made a mockery of physical laws, was tearing through the Fang's defenses. Thousand Suns, rubric marines, those soulless automatons animated by trapped spirits, advanced in perfect lockstep through corridors they had once called home. Demons of Sinch manifested wherever Magnus's power weakened the veil between material reality and the warp. The defenders were holding, but barely, and they would not be able to maintain their resistance much longer without support. Bjorn's strategic mind, honed by 10,000 years of warfare, assessed the situation with clinical precision. The Fang's labyrinthine structure favored the defenders, forcing the attackers to fight in close quarters where superior numbers meant less. The Space Wolves knew every corridor, every hidden passage, every choke point that could be held. But Magnus possessed knowledge of the Fang as well, and his sorcerous power gave him options that conventional attackers would never have. He could teleport his forces past defenses, could transform the very architecture of the fortress into weapons against its defenders. What was needed was not merely tactical competence, but something more. The defenders needed to blunt Magnus's advantage, to force the Daemon Primarch into a direct confrontation where his overwhelming power could be challenged. And there was only one warrior present who had both the capability and the authority to do so. Bjorn took command with the casual authority of one who had led entire chapters. His orders crackled through the Vox network, precise and economical. Defensive positions were reinforced. Counterattacks were launched at critical junctures to disrupt Thousand Suns' advances, and Bjorn himself moved toward the center of the storm, toward the location where Magnus's psychic signature burned like a dark star in his senses. The confrontation, when it came, shook the very foundations of the Fang. Magnus had penetrated deep into the fortress, had reached one of the gene laboratories, where the Space Wolves' precious genetic material was stored. His purpose there was obvious. If he could steal or destroy the gene seed, he could ensure the Space Wolves never recovered from this day. The ultimate revenge for Prospero. Bjorn arrived before Magnus could complete his work. The Demon Primarch turned to face the ancient Dreadnought, with what might have been amusement in those otherworldly eyes. Here was a mortal warrior, barely more than a brain in a metal box, daring to stand against a being of divine power. It should have been comical, an ant challenging a demigod. But Magnus recognized Bjorn. More than recognized him. He sensed in the ancient warrior's soul an echo from the past, a presence he had felt before during the burning of Prospero. This was one of the executioners who had destroyed his world, who had turned his city of enlightenment into ashes and rubble. And that recognition transformed what should have been a simple execution into something more personal. The battle that followed would be recorded in the Space Wolves' sagas for millennia to come. Bjorn attacked with all the fury he had accumulated over thousands of years. His assault cannon roared, each shell striking with precision that forced Magnus to defend rather than attack. His true claw lashed out in sequences that drew on every combat technique Bjorn had learned across his impossibly long existence. And through it all, he advanced, pushing the Demon Primarch back, out of the laboratory, through corridors and chambers, until they fought in the open air on the slopes of the Fang itself. Magnus fought back with the terrible power of a Demon Primarch fully committed to battle. Sorcerous flames washed over Bjorn's chassis, warping metal and scoring ceramite. Telekinetic blows struck like siege weapons, each impact strong enough to destroy a normal dreadnought. Reality itself bent to Magnus's will, the very air becoming hostile to anything that opposed him. And yet, Bjorn endured. His ancient sarcophagus, built with technology from a more enlightened age, absorbed punishment that should have destroyed him. His stubborn refusal to yield, that same quality that had defined him since Grith, kept him functional even as systems failed and damage mounted. The turning point came when Bjorn's assault cannon found its mark, striking Magnus's chest with a burst that actually drew demonic ichor. The demon Primarch recoiled, more surprised than hurt. But that moment of vulnerability was all Bjorn needed. His true claw descended in a strike that tore through Magnus's defenses, scoring a wound that the demon Primarch had not suffered since the heresy itself. Magnus's retaliation was devastating. With a gesture and a word of power, he destroyed both of Bjorn's weapons arms, tearing them from the Dreadnought's chassis and leaving Bjorn momentarily defenseless. But even disarmed, Bjorn refused to yield. He charged at Magnus, attempting to grapple the demon Primarch and drag him over the cliff edge where they battled. It was a desperate move, one that would likely have killed them both, but Bjorn had never been afraid of death. Magnus, recognizing the same impossible determination he had seen in the Space Wolves at Prospero, prepared to end the ancient warrior. His hand rose, gathering power for a killing blow. But before he could strike, a new combatant entered the battle. Harek Ironhelm, the current Great Wolf, had arrived with relief forces. The sudden arrival of fresh troops, combined with the injuries Bjorn had inflicted, convinced Magnus that discretion was the wiser course. The demon Primarch withdrew, teleporting away with his remaining forces, his vengeance incomplete, but still satisfied that he had dealt the Space Wolves a severe blow. Bjorn, his chassis ruined and his systems failing, collapsed where he stood. The Iron Priests rushed to his side, already planning the extensive repairs that would be required to restore him to functionality. They worked with frantic dedication, understanding that if Bjorn died here, after holding off a demon Primarch through sheer willpower and tactical genius, the loss to the chapter would be incalculable. As in the aftermath of the battle, as the Space Wolves counted their dead and surveyed the damage to their fortress monastery, the story of Bjorn's stand against Magnus spread like wildfire. He had faced a being of godlike power, a demon Primarch in the full bloom of his dark magnificence, and he had not merely survived, but actually hurt Magnus. The injuries Bjorn inflicted were the greatest damage the Crimson King had suffered since the heresy. That achievement, perhaps more than anything else in his long existence, cemented Bjorn's legend. But Bjorn himself took little satisfaction from the victory. When he finally returned to consciousness, after weeks of repair and reconstruction, his first thoughts were not of glory or triumph, but of the cost. Good warriors had died defending the Fang, the gene laboratories had been damaged, and setting back the chapter's recruiting efforts by years. And he himself had come perilously close to final destruction, saved only by the intervention of others at the critical moment. Victory had been achieved, but at a price that made Bjorn question whether the Imperium could afford many more such victories. The months of shame. Nearly 9,000 years after the Battle of the Fang, another crisis would draw Bjorn from his slumber, though this time the threat came not from without, but from within the Imperium itself. The First War for Armageddon had ended with a costly victory against the forces of chaos. The demon Primarch Angron had been banished back to the warp, but only through the sacrifice of an entire company of Grey Knights. The Space Wolves, who had fought alongside the Astartes of Titan during that desperate campaign, as believed the matter concluded. They could not have been more wrong. The Inquisition, in its infinite paranoia, determined that everyone who had witnessed demonic possession during the war needed to be dealt with. This included not just the citizens of Armageddon, but also the Imperial Guard regiments, who had fought so bravely, and even some elements of the Space Wolves themselves, who had been exposed to Chaos's taint. The solution proposed by Inquisitor Lord Gesmi Kisnaros was simple and brutal. Execution or sterilization for all witnesses, the complete erasure of knowledge about what had transpired on Armageddon. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf, responded with characteristic fury when he learned of this plan. The Space Wolves had promised protection to the people of Armageddon. They would not stand by while the Inquisition murdered innocents who had only been guilty of surviving a war zone. What followed was a period of escalating tension that future historians would call the months of shame. The Space Wolves began evacuating Imperial Guard units before the Inquisition could execute them. The Grey Knights, serving as the military arm of the Ordo Malleus, found themselves hunting their erstwhile allies. And the Inquisition's fleet moved toward Fenris itself, prepared to force compliance through overwhelming military power. It was during the height of this crisis, with an inquisitorial fleet in orbit around Fenris and negotiations teetering on the edge of open warfare, that the Space Wolves awakened Bjorn. They needed someone who could speak with authority that even the Inquisition would have to acknowledge, and someone whose very existence commanded respect across the Imperium. Someone who might be able to find a path through this crisis that did not end in civil war. Bjorn's awakening was conducted in haste, under circumstances remarkably similar to his revival during the Battle of the Fang. The situation was explained to him in terse, economical language. The Inquisition believed they were in the right. Logan Grimnar believed he was defending innocent lives and the honor of the Space Wolves. Both sides had committed to their positions, neither willing to back down, and blood had already been spilled in skirmishes between their forces. The ancient warrior's assessment of the situation was characteristically blunt. Both sides were being idiots. The Inquisition's plan to execute millions of innocent imperial citizens, choose soldiers who had fought bravely against chaos, was tactically and morally bankrupt. Yes, chaos taint was a real concern. Yes, some of those exposed might eventually fall to corruption. But wholesale slaughter was not the solution. It wasted valuable human resources, created martyrs, and fundamentally undermined the very thing the Imperium claimed to be protecting. But Logan Grimnar's response, while emotionally satisfying, was equally problematic. By directly opposing the Inquisition's will, he was inviting exactly the kind of internal conflict that chaos thrived upon. Every Space Wolf who died fighting Grey Knights was one less warrior available to defend humanity against its actual enemies. Every ship destroyed in these skirmishes was one less vessel patrolling the Imperium's borders. The whole situation was exactly the kind of fratricidal madness that had made the Horus heresy so devastating. A peace conference was arranged. Kisnaros would come to the Fang personally to meet with Bjorn, who would speak on behalf of the Space Wolves, since Logan Grimnar had been somewhat compromised by his role in recent events. The meeting was tense from the start. Kisnaros arrived expecting to deal with a recalcitrant chapter that needed to be reminded of its place in the imperial hierarchy. What he got instead was something entirely different. The moment Kisnaros learned that he was being received by Bjorn the Fell-Handed, something changed in his demeanor. The Inquisitor Lord had studied enough history to understand what Bjorn represented. This was not just another Space Marine, not even just another chapter master. This was a living link to the age of the Emperor, a warrior who had fought in the Great Crusade and heresy, who had seen the Master of Mankind with his own eyes. The weight of that revelation was too much for even an Inquisitor's pride to ignore. When Bjorn spoke, describing his experiences during the age of the Emperor, Kisnaros went to his knees in a gesture of reverence that shocked his own retinue. The famous exchange that followed has been recorded in multiple sources, though details vary slightly. "You walked in the age of the Emperor?" Kisnaros asked, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief. Bjorn's mechanical voice carried what might have been amusement. "Walked, ran, pissed, and killed. I did it all. I met the Allfather, you know. Fought at his side more than once. I do believe he liked me." The Inquisitor Lord's gesture of submission, going to his knees before a Space Marine, was unprecedented. It signaled more clearly than words that he understood he was dealing with something beyond the normal hierarchy of the Imperium. Bjorn, for his part, found the gesture exasperating. He had not asked for this kind of reverence, did not particularly want it, and was more interested in finding a practical solution to the immediate crisis than in receiving worship from an overly impressed Inquisitor. But practical solutions were hard to come by. Even as Bjorn negotiated with Kisnaros, Logan Grimnar was taking more direct action. The Great Wolf had grown tired of waiting for diplomacy to work. He led a boarding action against the Inquisition flagship, intending to confront Kisnaros directly and force an end to the conflict through the simple expedient of eliminating its architect. In the battle that followed, Grimna slew Kisnaros personally, cutting down the Inquisitor Lord in a moment of righteous fury that felt satisfying but solved nothing. Bjorn, learning of this development, knew that the situation had escalated beyond negotiation. Blood had been spilled. An Inquisitor Lord had been killed by a Space Marine chapter master. Unless someone acted quickly to de-escalate, this conflict would spiral into full-scale civil war. So he did something he had never done before in his 10,000 years of service. Something that represented such a violation of his personal preferences that it spoke volumes about his commitment to preventing further bloodshed. He used a teleporter. But Bjorn had always been hesitant about teleportation technology. The idea of having his consciousness transmitted through the warp, even briefly, even with all the protections and safeguards that teleportarium systems employed, fundamentally disturbed him. But this was not a time for personal squeamishness. The Great Wolf's flagship was full of Grey Knights, preparing to retaliate against Grimna's attack. If someone did not intervene immediately, the slaughter would continue and perhaps escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Bjorn materialized on the bridge of the Grey Knight's vessel in the middle of the chaos following Kisnaros's death. His massive form dominated the space, his presence commanding immediate attention. Around him, Space Wolves, Terminators, and Grey Knights were locked in combat. Ancient warriors who should have been brothers, killing each other over a dispute that benefited no one but chaos itself. "Enough!" Bjorn's voice boomed through the bridge, amplified by his voxcasters until it drowned out the sounds of combat. Not a request, not a suggestion. A command issued with 10,000 years of authority behind it. The fighting stopped. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, as warriors on both sides recognized what had just arrived among them. The eldest, the last of the company of Russ. A living legend whose service predated their chapters, whose experience dwarfed their combined lifetimes. Even Grey Knights, those warriors who answered to no authority save the Inquisition itself, found themselves hesitating before such a figure. When what followed was the kind of negotiation that only someone with Bjorn's unique position could have conducted. He spoke to both sides, not as a partisan, but as a witness to history, someone who had seen what happened when the Imperium turned upon itself during the Horus Heresy. He reminded them that every warrior who died in this fratricidal conflict was a victory for chaos, that the real enemy was not the Inquisition or the Space Wolves, but the forces of darkness that pressed in on all sides, waiting for humanity to destroy itself through internal strife. The Grey Knights, in particular, found themselves moved by Bjorn's words. These were warriors of exceptional dedication, chosen for their resistance to chaos and their unwavering faith. To hear someone who had fought beside the Emperor himself speak of the heresy's horrors, but to understand what internal conflict could cost the Imperium, made them reconsider their position. A Grey Knight named Hyperion, who would later become a prognosticar of his chapter, found himself profoundly affected by the encounter with Bjorn. The compromise that emerged from these negotiations satisfied no one, which in Bjorn's cynical estimation meant it was probably the best solution available. The Inquisition would withdraw from Fenris and cease its persecution of Imperial Guard survivors from Armageddon. In exchange, the Space Wolves would cease their active resistance to inquisitorial authority and accept a form of penance, though the exact nature of that penance would be negotiated rather than imposed. And crucially, a Grey Knight would come to the Fang to speak with the Space Wolves about his chapter, so that future generations would remember the Grey Knights not as enemies, but as brothers who had been forced into an impossible situation. Bjorn had one additional demand, delivered in his characteristically blunt fashion. The Inquisition would never return to Fenris, not in his lifetime, which, given his nature as a Dreadnought, meant essentially forever. The Space Wolves had cooperated in finding a peaceful resolution to this crisis. They had allowed diplomacy to succeed where violence had failed. But their patience was not unlimited, and any future attempts by the Inquisition to impose its will on Fenris would be met with the full fury of the chapter, with Bjorn himself leading the defense. But the months of shame ended not with victory for either side, but with a grudging recognition that the alternative to compromise was mutual destruction. It was not a satisfying conclusion. Logan Grimnar remained bitter about what had been done to the people of Armageddon. The Inquisition felt that its authority had been undermined by having to negotiate with Space Marines, rather than simply imposing its will. But the Imperium survived intact, and that, in the end, was what mattered. Bjorn, for his part, returned to his rest with a sense of profound weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. He had spent 10,000 years watching humanity make the same mistakes over and over, seeing good warriors die because their leaders could not overcome pride or dogma, witnessing the slow decline of an Imperium that had once seemed invincible. The months of shame were just one more example of this pattern, one more crisis that could have been avoided with a modicum of wisdom and restraint. As he descended into stasis sleep once more, Bjorn found himself wondering how many more of these crises he would be awakened to resolve before his ancient systems finally failed, and he was granted the peace of true death. The living legend. In the 41st millennium, Bjorn the Fell-Handed stands as something unique in the Imperium of man. He is not merely the oldest living space marine, though that distinction alone would be remarkable. He is a living bridge to an age that has passed into legend, a consciousness that remembers when the Emperor walked among mortals and guided humanity with his own hand. To grasp what this means, as one must understand the profound isolation of Bjorn's existence. Imagine being the last living witness to events that most people consider mythology. Every person you knew in your youth has been dead for millennia. Every battle you fought in during your prime has been transmuted by time into saga and legend. The hard realities of blood and death transformed into stories told to inspire young warriors. Every decision you made, every mistake you learned from, every triumph you achieved, all of it happened in a world so different from the present that it might as well be a different galaxy entirely. For the Space Wolves, Bjorn represents continuity across impossible spans of time. They revere him not just as a mighty warrior, though his combat prowess is beyond question, but as a living reminder of their origins. When younger Space Marines train in the halls of the Fang, they walk past chambers where Bjorn once trained. When they take their oaths of service, they swear upon traditions that Bjorn helped establish. When they deploy into battle, they fight using tactics that Bjorn pioneered or perfected through hard experience. He is woven into the very fabric of the chapter, in ways that make him inseparable from their identity. But Bjorn's significance extends beyond the Space Wolves. Throughout the Imperium, there are those who understand what his continued existence represents. Inquisitors study his recorded statements, seeking insights into how the Emperor's forces operated during the Great Crusade. Historians analyze the few interviews they have managed to secure with him, trying to separate fact from legend in the murky history of the heresy. Other Space Marine chapters send emissaries to the Fang on the rare occasions when Bjorn is awakened, hoping to speak with one who can remember what the legions were like before the second founding divided them into chapters. Even beings who should know better find themselves moved to reverence in Bjorn's presence. The encounter with Inquisitor Kisnaros during the months of shame was not unique. Even Grey Knights, those warriors who have been psycho-conditioned to resist awe and worship, find themselves affected when confronting Bjorn. Hyperion, the Grey Knight who witnessed Bjorn's intervention to end the conflict, later recorded that speaking with the ancient warrior was like touching history itself, like being in the presence of a living Primarch. This weight of reverence is both a blessing and a burden for Bjorn. On one hand, as it ensures that when he speaks, others listen. His word carries authority that few beings in the Imperium can match. Even Logan Grimnar, the great wolf who has led the Space Wolves for more than 700 years, and who bows to no outside authority, defers to Bjorn's judgment when the ancient warrior is awakened. This ability to command respect, to cut through politics and pride with the simple fact of his existence, has allowed Bjorn to intervene in crises that might otherwise have spiraled out of control. On the other hand, the reverence others show him creates a distance that compounds his isolation. When younger Space Marines approach him, they do so with such awe that genuine conversation becomes difficult. They see him as a figure of legend rather than as a person. And that perception makes it hard for Bjorn to connect with them in any meaningful way. Even other Dreadnoughts, who should understand something of what he experiences, treat him differently because of his unique status. He is not just another ancient warrior entombed in a walking war machine. He is the eldest, and that title creates barriers that cannot be easily crossed. There is also the matter of his role as the chapter's memory. Every century, when Bjorn is awakened for the Great Feast, he must perform the role of storyteller, sharing memories of an age that grows more distant with each telling. But memory is imperfect, and 10,000 years is a span beyond what the human mind, even one enhanced by Space Marine physiology and preserved in a Dreadnought sarcophagus, was meant to endure. Bjorn knows that his recollections are degrading, that details are being lost or confused, that each telling of a story might incorporate elements from other memories or fill gaps with imagination rather than fact. This awareness haunts him. He is supposed to be the chapter's link to its past. But what if that link is corroding? What if the stories he tells, which younger Space Wolves accept as gospel truth, are actually distortions of what really happened? There is no way to verify his memories against external sources. The participants in those long-ago events are all dead. The records from that age are fragmentary at best, and many have been lost entirely to time and disaster. Bjorn is the only witness left, and he fears that he is an unreliable one. Yet the Space Wolves need him to be more than that. They need him to be a perfect repository of their history, an unchanging link to the age of Leman Russ. So Bjorn tells his stories with as much accuracy as he can muster, and he does not speak of his doubts or fears, because even flawed memory is better than no memory at all. And if he were to admit the full extent of his uncertainty, he would undermine the very purpose he has been preserved to serve. There is another aspect to Bjorn's significance that few outside the Space Wolves understand. When he sleeps in his Dreadnought sarcophagus, his spirit does not simply rest in dormant unconsciousness. Bjorn has become something more than a warrior bound to a machine. His very soul has grown powerful enough to defend the Fang, even while his consciousness slumbers. In the warp, in that realm where thought and reality merge, Bjorn stands vigil atop the hexagrammatic ramparts that protect the Space Wolves' fortress monastery from demonic assault. This is knowledge kept secret even from most of the chapter. Only the Rune Priests and the Wolf Priests understand that Bjorn's presence acts as a ward against corruption. Demons attempting to manifest near the Fang find themselves confronted by an ancient warrior whose will has been tempered by 10,000 years of service. His fury, that cold anger that has defined him since Gryth, burns like a beacon in the warp, driving back entities that might otherwise slip through weaknesses in the material realm. It is the ultimate expression of his guardianship, protecting the Space Wolves, not just when he is awakened and fighting, but even in his deepest sleep. The irony of this does not escape Bjorn in his more reflective moments. He who resents his existence as a Dreadnought, who views his entombment as a curse rather than a gift, has become essential to the chapter's survival in ways that go far beyond his combat capabilities. He is both weapon and ward, warrior and guardian, legend and reality. Remove him, and the Space Wolves would not merely lose a powerful fighter or a valuable source of historical knowledge. They would lose a fundamental part of what makes them who they are. But the question that haunts Bjorn, that surfaces during those brief moments between awakening and full consciousness, is simple and terrible. How much longer can he endure? His organic components are deteriorating despite the best efforts of the Iron Priests. His mechanical systems, while maintained with religious devotion, are showing signs of wear that accumulate across the millennia. Most critically, his consciousness, that spark of awareness that makes him Bjorn, rather than just a sophisticated war machine, is eroding under the strain of impossible time and repeated transitions between existence and void. Every awakening is harder than the last. Every return to consciousness requires more effort, more will, more of a commitment to continue existing when non-existence would be so much easier. And Bjorn wonders, during those dark moments of self-reflection, what will happen when that commitment finally fails? What will remain of him then? Will he become like the oldest Blood Angels' dreadnoughts, those ancient warriors who have descended into madness because their minds could not endure the weight of centuries? Or will he simply cease to function one day, his systems failing as organic and mechanical components alike give up their long struggle against entropy? Or will he keep going, keep fighting, keep enduring, until the wolf time arrives and Leman Russ returns to lead his sons in the final battle against chaos? That is the promise that has sustained the Space Wolves for 10,000 years. The belief that their Primarch will come back when he is needed most. And if that promise is true, then Bjorn must endure until that day, must maintain his vigil across whatever span of time remains between now and that prophesied ending. It is a heavy burden, perhaps the heaviest burden any warrior of the Imperium has ever been asked to bear. And Bjorn carries it with the same cold determination that has characterized his entire existence. From the day he lost his hand on Prospero to the present moment when he stands as the last living witness to an age of legend, the Eternal Guardian. In the current era of the 41st Millennium, as the Imperium faces threats that seem to multiply with each passing decade, Bjorn the Fell-Handed remains in his vigil. The galaxy has been torn in two by the Great Rift, that vast wound in reality that splits the Imperium into distinct halves with only the most perilous routes connecting them. Chaos forces pour through breaches in the Materium with unprecedented frequency. Xenos races press in on all sides, sensing the Imperium's weakness and seeking to exploit it. And yet, the Space Wolves endure, as they have endured for 10,000 years, holding fast to Fenris and the traditions their Primarch established. But Bjorn's role in this new age of crisis has, if anything, become more important. The Indomitus Crusade, launched by the returned Primarch Robut Guilliman to reclaim the Imperium Nihilus, saw Space Wolves forces deployed across countless battlefields. During this tumultuous period, the chapter called upon their ancient warrior multiple times, his wisdom and experience proving invaluable in battles against enemies that seemed to defy conventional tactics. Each awakening reminded the Imperium that the Space Wolves possessed something no other chapter could claim, a direct link to the age of the Emperor, a warrior who had fought in the Great Crusade itself. But the greatest tests may still lie ahead. The Space Wolves speak of the Wolf Time as that prophesied era when Leman Russ will return and lead his sons in the final battle against the forces of chaos. It is said that when that day comes, when the galaxy stands at the brink of ultimate destruction, the Wolf King will emerge from whatever realm he has inhabited for these 10,000 years, and the Space Wolves will rally to his call for one last, apocalyptic confrontation with their eternal enemies. If that prophecy is true, then Bjorn must endure until that moment arrives. He must maintain his vigil, must preserve the memory of what the Space Wolves were, so that when Russ returns, his Primarch will find warriors worthy of the name. It is this belief, perhaps more than anything else, that sustains Bjorn through the long centuries of his existence. He is not merely surviving, he is waiting, preparing, and ensuring that when the hour of greatest need arrives, the Space Wolves will be ready. There is a legend among the chapter, whispered in the quiet moments between battles, that Bjorn will know when the wolf time begins. That his connection to Leman Russ, forged in the fires of the Great Crusade and tempered by millennia of loyal service, will alert him to his Primarch's return before any other. On that day, it is said, Bjorn will rise from his sarcophagus one final time, not for a temporary deployment or a ceremonial appearance, but for the last great war. And in that final battle, fighting at Russ's side once more as he did 10,000 years ago, Bjorn the Fell-Handed will at last find the peace that has eluded him for so long. Whether this legend has any basis in truth, or whether the wolf time will actually arrive or is merely a comforting story the space wolves tell themselves to maintain hope in dark times, no one can say with certainty. But for Bjorn, the possibility is enough. It gives meaning to his suffering, purpose to his continued existence, and a goal beyond mere survival. He endures because someone must. He fights because that is what he has always done. And he waits, in the darkness between awakenings, for the day when his long vigil finally ends. The younger Space Marines who look upon Bjorn see a legend, a hero from an age of glory who still walks among them. They do not see the isolation, the erosion of identity, the terrible weight of being the last of your kind. They do not understand what it costs him each time he awakens, as each time he forces himself to exist when the void of stasis sleep would be so much more merciful. And perhaps that is for the best. Let them have their legend. Let them believe in the invincible ancient warrior who has defied death for 10,000 years. Let them find inspiration in his example, strength in his continued service. Because the truth, the reality of what Bjorn has become and what he has sacrificed, is too heavy a burden for any but the strongest souls to bear. He is not merely a warrior or a legend. He is a cautionary tale, an example of what duty demands when all else has been stripped away. He is proof that the Imperium's survival requires sacrifices that go beyond mere death, sacrifices that extend across millennia and consume everything that makes a being who they are. And yet, despite everything, despite the suffering and isolation and the slow erosion of his very identity, Bjorn continues to serve. Not because he enjoys it, not because he expects reward or recognition, but because service is what he knows. It is what he has always known. From the day he first took up arms as a young warrior of the Third Great Company to this present moment when he stands as the oldest warrior in the Imperium. Service to the Emperor, to the Space Wolves, to the ideals they represent, even when those ideals seem tarnished by 10,000 years of compromise and decay. In the Hall of the Revered Fallen, deep beneath the Fang, Bjorn's sarcophagus rests among those of other ancient warriors. Ice crystals form upon its surface during the long years of dormancy, making the metal glitter in the dim light like frozen stars. Tech priests come and go, while performing their daily rituals of maintenance, speaking prayers to machine spirits that may or may not exist. And within the sarcophagus, Bjorn sleeps, his consciousness adrift in that peculiar state between existence and oblivion that characterizes Dreadnought stasis. He dreams, sometimes, though the nature of those dreams is unclear even to him. Fragments of memory from his mortal life surface and recede like waves upon a distant shore. Battles fought and won, brothers long since dead, conversations whose words have been lost, but whose emotional resonance remains. And always, always, the image of Leman Russ, the Wolf King, the Primarch he served with devotion so absolute that even 10,000 years of abandonment could not quite extinguish it. Bjorn's legacy to the Space Wolves, and to the Imperium as a whole, cannot be measured simply in victories won or enemies slain, though those accomplishments alone would secure him a place in history. His true legacy lies in what he represents. He is proof that the Age of Legends was real, that the Emperor and his Primarchs truly did walk among humanity, that the Great Crusade was not merely myth or propaganda, but actual history. In an Imperium where truth is often buried under layers of dogma and false religion, where the past has been rewritten so many times that fact becomes indistinguishable from fiction, Bjorn stands as an anchor point, a fixed reference that cannot be denied or dismissed. He is also, in a darker sense, a reminder of the Imperium's ultimate nature. His existence demonstrates what the Emperor's vision requires of those who serve it. Total commitment, complete sacrifice. What the surrender of everything that makes life worth living in exchange for the simple continuation of duty. Bjorn is what the Imperium makes of its heroes, and there is something terrible in that transformation. But perhaps most importantly, Bjorn represents hope. Not the false hope of propaganda, or the desperate hope of those who have no other option, but the stubborn, defiant hope of one who has endured the worst the galaxy can offer and refuses to quit. For 10,000 years, he has watched the Imperium decline, has witnessed the slow erosion of everything the Emperor sought to build, has seen humanity beset by enemies from without and within. And yet, he persists. He continues to fight. He maintains his vigil. If Bjorn, who has every reason to despair, who has suffered losses that would break most beings, yet can still find the strength to serve, then perhaps there is hope for the Imperium as well. Perhaps humanity can endure these dark times and emerge into a brighter age. Perhaps the sacrifices demanded by duty are not in vain, and the long watch will eventually reach its end. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the Imperium is doomed, slowly dying under the weight of its own contradictions and the relentless pressure of its enemies. Perhaps the wolf time will never arrive, and Leman Russ will never return, and Bjorn will simply continue his vigil until his ancient systems finally fail and he is granted the peace of oblivion. Perhaps there is no meaning to any of it beyond the simple, brutal fact that existence continues until it doesn't. Bjorn does not know the answer to these questions, cannot know, or because the future remains unwritten, and the great powers that shape the galaxy do not share their plans with mere mortals, even those who have lived for 10 millennia. So he does what he has always done. He endures. He fights when awakened. He sleeps when his duty is done. And he waits, in that darkness between consciousness and void, for whatever ending fate has prepared for him. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, Bjorn the Fell-Handed stands as both warning and inspiration. He is what duty demands. He is what service costs. He is the price the Imperium extracts from its greatest warriors. But he is also proof that some things endure, that some oaths cannot be broken, that some warriors will never surrender, no matter how heavy the burden becomes. He is the eldest, the last from the company of Russ, the oldest living warrior in the Imperium. And as long as his consciousness persists, as long as his ancient systems continue to function, the Space Wolves will never be alone in their vigil. They will always have one who remembers when the galaxy was young, who can speak of the Emperor with the authority of one who saw him face to face, who carries within his scarred psyche the memory of an age when heroes walked among men and the Imperium seemed destined for glory rather than slow decline. That is Bjorn's gift to the chapter he has served for so long. Not merely his combat prowess or his tactical genius, though both are formidable, but his presence, his existence, his refusal to let the past be forgotten or dismissed. As long as Bjorn endures, the Age of Legend remains real, and the Space Wolves can believe that the return of their Primarch is not merely wishful thinking, but prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. And so Bjorn sleeps and waits, and dreams of the day when his long vigil finally ends, and he can lay down the burden he has carried for 10,000 years. That day may come tomorrow, or it may not arrive for another 10 millennia. But whenever it comes, whether in glorious victory or final defeat, Bjorn the Fell-Handed will meet it with the same cold determination that has defined his entire existence. For he is a space wolf, a son of Fenris, a warrior of the Imperium, and he will serve until the very end. If you enjoyed learning about Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the oldest dreadnought in Warhammer 40k, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell from the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps make these deep dives into the lore possible. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the darkness of the far future, there is only war.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.